Imagine waking in a dim, smoke-filled room, the air heavy with herbs and whispered prayers. Outside, the world moves as it always has, fields tilled, markets opened, but inside, time feels suspended. You are surrounded not by certainty, but by quiet fear. In medieval Europe, childbirth was not simply a beginning. For many, it was a threshold, one that could just as easily lead to death as to life. Most people imagine the Middle Ages as harsh, but even within that harshness, there was one experience more dangerous than almost any other. And yet, it happened every day. For centuries, childbirth defined the rhythm of medieval life. It was expected, inevitable, and deeply woven into the structure of family, labor, and survival. But beneath that inevitability lay a reality that is often misunderstood. Modern portrayals sometimes soften it, depicting childbirth as difficult, but manageable. The historical record tells a different story. For women in medieval Europe, childbirth was one of the most significant risks they would ever face. This is not simply a story of medical limitation. It is a story of belief, of community, of fear, and of a system where survival was never guaranteed. To understand childbirth in medieval Europe, you have to step into a world without modern medicine, without antiseptics, without a clear understanding of infection. Knowledge of the human body was limited, often shaped by ancient texts and religious interpretations rather than direct scientific observation. In many parts of Europe, childbirth was overseen not by physicians, but by midwives, women whose knowledge came from experience, oral tradition, and observation. Physicians, when present, were often called only in extreme cases, and even then, their methods were constrained by the same lack of understanding. Childbirth typically took place at home, in a space prepared specifically for the event. Windows were covered, fires were lit, and rooms were warmed to create what was believed to be a safe, controlled environment. Friends and female relatives gathered, forming what was known as the lying-in chamber, a place both intimate and isolating. Religion was ever present. Prayers were spoken, relics placed nearby, and invocations made to saints believed to protect women in labor. Among them, figures like Saint Margaret were called upon, her story symbolizing endurance through suffering. But even with preparation, even with ritual, there was an unspoken truth: no one could predict how it would end. For most women, childbirth was not a single event, it was a repeated experience. Families depended on children for labor and survival, and as a result, women often gave birth many times over the course of their lives. Each pregnancy carried its own risks. Labor could last hours, sometimes days. Without effective pain management, the process was physically exhausting and deeply uncertain. You can imagine the room, dim light flickering against stone or timber walls, the smell of smoke and sweat, voices low but urgent. The midwife guides the process, using techniques passed down through generations, positioning the body, offering herbal remedies, encouraging movement. But there were limits to what could be done. If a baby was positioned incorrectly, there were few safe ways to intervene. If labor stalled, the options were limited and often dangerous. Infections, though not understood in modern terms, were a constant threat, arising from unclean tools, hands, or the environment itself. For ordinary people, survival depended as much on chance as on care. And yet, childbirth was not viewed solely as a medical event. It was a communal one. Women supported each other, shared knowledge, and created a space where experience mattered. In a world dominated by uncertainty, this network offered some measure of control. What made childbirth in medieval Europe especially dangerous was not just the absence of medical knowledge, it was the combination of risk and expectation. Women were expected to endure. Pain was often framed through a religious lens, seen as part of a broader moral or spiritual order. This interpretation shaped how suffering was understood, and sometimes, how it was accepted. Complications that today might be treated routinely could become life-threatening. Hemorrhage, obstructed labor, and postpartum infections were among the most common causes of death. Without surgical options or sterile environments, even minor complications could escalate quickly. Historians estimate that maternal mortality rates were significantly higher than today, though exact figures vary. The risk was real enough that death during childbirth was a known and accepted possibility. And it wasn't just the mothers. Infant mortality was also high. Many children did not survive their first days or weeks. This reality influenced how families formed emotional bonds, how communities mourned, and how life itself was understood. But perhaps the least discussed aspect is how normalized this risk became. It was not seen as an anomaly. It was part of life. For those who survived, childbirth often left lasting consequences. Physical recovery could be slow, especially in cases of prolonged or difficult labor. In some instances, women experienced injuries that affected their mobility or long-term health. Beyond the physical, there was the emotional weight. The loss of a child, or the near loss of one's own life, was not rare. It was woven into the fabric of family experience. You can imagine a household where births and deaths were closely intertwined. Where joy and grief existed side by side, sometimes within the same room. Childbirth in medieval Europe was not just a beginning, it was a test of endurance, shaped by a world where knowledge was limited and outcomes were never certain. It reminds us that history is not only made of events, but of experiences, quiet, personal moments that carried immense weight. So the question becomes, how much of what we believe about the past is shaped by myth, and how much by reality we have yet to fully understand? If this perspective changed how you see medieval life, you might want to explore how other everyday experiences,